My wife couldn't get pregnant, but she exchanged souls with her bestie. 1. My wife Su Ro and her bestie Lu Ruan were drinking at home. They were both dressed coolly and smiling. After I got home, my wife said that Lu Ruan had quarreled with her husband and wanted to stay at my house for a few days. I nodded in agreement. My wife is thin and small, with a sweet and lovely appearance, while Lu Ruan is tall and has a cold queen style. After having dinner with them, I went back to the room to rest. I was a little sleepy after a day's work, so I fell asleep in a daze. In a trance, I felt the bedroom door open, and a woman staggered onto the bed and got into my arms. I hugged her tightly, but I felt something was wrong the next second. My wife is thin and small, but the woman in her arms is very tall and plump. It's bad. I woke up all of a sudden. I quickly turned on the bedside lamp and looked down. The woman in my arms turned out to be Lu Ruan. She was a little drunk and smelled of alcohol. When the light shone, she said in a daze, "Honey, why did you turn on the light? Turn it off." I sat up suddenly, scared, and said in a cold sweat, "Lu Ruan, you drank too much, you went to the wrong room." Lu Ruan was stunned, then sneered and said, "Honey, you are not dreaming, are you? Dreaming of Lu Ruan? Look carefully, I am your wife." What a ghost. I ran out of the room and saw my wife staggering out of the bathroom. I quickly hugged my wife from behind and said, "Baby, how much did you drink?" Lu Ruan ran into our room. But my wife in my arms was startled. She quickly broke free, then looked at me and said shyly, "Brother-in-law, I think you are drunk, I am Lu Ruan." What? I widened my eyes. Was I hallucinating, or were these two women drunk? At this time, Lu Ruan also walked out of the room. After seeing my wife and me, she was petrified, and then looked at us in disbelief and shouted, "You? Me? What's going on?" My wife was also dumbfounded. She murmured to herself, "Su Ro, have we exchanged souls?" What? I was also stunned, and the corners of my mouth kept twitching. After a sleepless night of conversation, we finally accepted this reality. My wife and her bestie, their souls have exchanged. 2. The soul of Lu Ruan lives in my wife's body, and the soul of my wife lives in Lu Ruan's body. The temperament and way of speaking of the two have been turned upside down. I looked at Lu Ruan's face, knowing that she was my wife, and smiled bitterly. "Baby, let's go to the hospital at dawn." My wife nodded, and Lu Ruan pressed against my wife's face and said seriously, "Brother-in-law, don't say baby to my body, I feel too weird." The corners of my mouth twitched, and I sighed helplessly. After we arrived at the hospital, I told the doctor about the condition. The doctor said with a look of fear, "Why don't you go to the 4th hospital? They specialize in treating mental illnesses like yours." I was so angry that the doctor thought we were mentally ill, so I asked tentatively, "Doctor, if they really exchanged souls, what should we do?" The doctor rolled his eyes and joked, "Then take both. Let's go, I'm very busy here." My wife and Lu Ruan looked at each other, smiled bitterly, and shook their heads. In order to make it easier to call them in the future, I decided to use souls as the basis. After leaving the hospital, my wife subconsciously held my arm. Lu Ruan hurriedly pulled my wife away, and then said with a red face, "No, you are too intimate like this, I am at a disadvantage, and if others see it, they will think I am cheating." My wife and I smiled awkwardly. After exchanging souls, it was really inconvenient. At this time, my wife was suddenly stunned and frowned and said, "Honey, it's my father's birthday tonight. What should we do in this situation?" I also frowned. My father-in-law is an old professor. He is serious and has sharp insight. Once he finds any clues, he can get to the bottom of it. Finally, after the three of us studied it, we still had to go home to celebrate my father-in-law's birthday. The three of us went together and could complement each other. We bought gifts and drove back to my father-in-law's house. 3. In order to pretend to be more like a couple, Lu Ruan took my arm at the door. I saw Lu Ruan blushing, and I pretended to be indifferent. My wife pouted, but it was hard to say anything because her body was now Lu Ruan's. After entering the house, I saw my father-in-law reading a newspaper and my mother-in-law cooking in the kitchen, so Lu Ruan and I awkwardly called Dad. My wife also awkwardly said happy birthday to Uncle. When my father-in-law saw the guests, he stood up and said, "Xiao Lu is here too. Come and sit down, thank you for coming to celebrate my birthday." During dinner, we chatted with my parents-in-law carefully, fearing that they would find out something. At this time, my father-in-law made a wish, and then smiled and said to me and Lu Ruan, "Dad's wish this year is that you let me become a grandfather." My wife and I looked at each other, and we both had our troubles. Because we went to the hospital for a checkup before, I had no problem, but she was born with dysplasia and the probability of pregnancy was very low. I also advised her that we would be a dink couple in the future and live happily without children. So I paused and wanted to tell my father-in-law the truth. Just when I opened my mouth to speak, I saw my wife suddenly winked at me frantically, so I was stunned, and at the same time I understood what my wife meant. I felt that her idea was a little crazy. After dinner, we drank tea and chatted. My wife sent me a message. "Honey, my body now is Lu Ruan's. We have done a checkup together before. She can give birth. We can give birth to a child with her body." I was stunned, but my heart was pounding. My father-in-law suddenly patted his forehead and said, "I am old. I am sleepy after drinking a glass of wine. You don't leave tonight." Xiao Lu lives in the guest room. After speaking, my father-in-law took my mother-in-law away. My father-in-law is the one who has the final say at home. What he says cannot be refused, but the three of us who stayed were dumbfounded. "You want me and wife to go back to the room? But she is Lu Ruan?" Just when the atmosphere was a little awkward, my wife said carelessly, "It's okay. You go. I believe you." After pushing us into the bedroom, my wife went to the guest room. Lu Ruan and I looked at each other awkwardly. I smiled helplessly and said, "It's okay. I'll just sleep on the floor." Lu Ruan touched the cold floor, rolled her eyes and said, "Let's sleep together. The floor is very cold. It's not good to catch a cold." I nodded with trembling lips. That night, we lay in bed, covered with a quilt. I was a little distracted. Looking at the most familiar stranger in front of me, I didn't know what to say. Lu Ruan was also a little shy. She looked at the ceiling and said, "I went to the hospital with Su Ro. She also told me about your situation. You are such a man." I smiled and said, "Because I love her, I can't leave her. Even if there is no child, what can it do? It is she who will spend the rest of my life with me, not the child." Lu Ruan had a look of approval in her eyes, and asked about my and my wife's love experience, with joy and tears. I smiled and recalled for a long time, then I asked her, "By the way, how are you and your husband? Why do you quarrel?" Lu Ruan said, "We had a flash marriage. It only took half a year from dating to getting the marriage certificate to the wedding. He treats me well, but it's a little strange. Forget it, I won't talk about it." I smelled the familiar fragrance, felt the temperament that didn't belong to my wife, and felt strange in my heart. Lu Ruan's legs shrank like a little rabbit and then snorted coldly. "Be good, don't be naughty." I could only smile bitterly, then turned around and controlled my thoughts. Lu Ruan stopped talking, and I suddenly turned around, looked into her eyes and said, "What if I can't get it back in my life?" Her eyes were a little flustered. "I don't know, let's take it one day at a time. Anyway, my husband doesn't love me. If it doesn't work, we can get a divorce." We were silent and fell asleep. 4. The next morning, I found her lying in my arms in a daze, and I subconsciously hugged her waist. The next second I was stunned, and I found that she opened her eyes. I suddenly realized it, and hurriedly stood up to apologize and said that I forgot. She looked at me shyly, and then nodded as if nothing had happened. After coming out of the room, I saw my wife looking at us, and then smiled maliciously. I gave her a more peaceful look and accompanied my parents-in-law for dinner. My father-in-law suddenly said that an old classmate would come today and asked us to go to the party. We could only agree that my wife's identity was Lu Ruan, so it was naturally not easy for her to attend this party. So we sent her home first, and then I took Lu Ruan to accompany the guests. During the meal, we were still cautious, and I drank a few glasses of wine. Finally, my father-in-law said, "Let's stay at his house today." Lu Ruan and I looked at each other and agreed helplessly. After I told my wife, she said it was okay, and we would go home tomorrow morning. So that night, I lay in bed with Lu Ruan again. I don't know if it was because of drinking or because my wife was not at home tonight. Lu Ruan and I were very relaxed, and Lu Ruan also told me the reason for her quarrel with her husband. It turned out that 2 months after the two got married, her husband had been saying that he was undergoing a treatment and could not have sex, and Lu Ruan believed it. But 2 days ago, when she was tidying up her husband's clothes, she suddenly found a small square in his pocket. They didn't have sex, so what does this small square mean? Lu Ruyan got angry on the spot. No matter how her husband begged, it didn't work, and her husband never said where the small square came from. So Lu Ruyan came to my house. After hearing this, I felt very troubled. Seeing that Lu Ruyan was in a low mood, I wanted to cheer her up, so I smiled and said. As a result, I got a big advantage. As soon as the voice fell, Lu Ruyan hit my chest with her pink fist, and I suddenly grabbed it. Lu Ruyan was stunned and her face turned red. I suddenly woke up. No, this won't work. All her senses belonged to Lu Ruyan. I can't let my wife down. I let go of her hand dejectedly and turned around. At this moment, Lu Ruyan suddenly hugged me from behind. 5. My phone suddenly rang. I looked at the caller ID and saw that it was my wife calling. I quickly answered the call and my wife's panicked voice came over. Husband, come back soon. Lu Ruyan's husband is here and knocking at the door. I dare not open the door. Upon hearing this, Lu Ruyan and I were shocked and quickly put on our clothes and drove home. On the way, I calmed down. I knew that Lu Ruyan just wanted to take revenge on her husband. If I really did it, then both of our families would be in pain. I felt guilty for my thoughts just now and felt sorry for my wife. Lu Ruyan was silent, as if she was a little ashamed and a little guilty. We didn't say anything along the way, and we tacitly agreed not to mention what happened just now. I saw Lu Ruyan's husband Wang Ji at the door of my house. He was thin, with fair skin, but a little haggard. Seeing us coming back, he hurriedly said, Brother, sister-in-law, I know Ruyan is at your house, I want to talk to her, please. Lu Ruyan and I looked at each other, and I saw a look of shame in her eyes, so I pretended to open the door as if nothing had happened. My wife was standing in the living room, dressed neatly, with a panicked look on her face. She was relieved when she saw me coming back. Wang Ji's eyes were red at this time. He came to my wife, suddenly knelt on the ground with a plop, and cried and said, Wife, come home with me, I was wrong, I swear I will never ignore you again, I'm sorry, forgive me. My wife quickly stepped back and looked at us in panic. I quickly pulled Wang Ji up, asked him to sit on the sofa, poured him a glass of water and said, Brother, don't cry, let's talk it over. Wang Ji wiped his tears with a tissue, looked at my wife and said, I have been reflecting on myself these days, wife, come home with me, I swear I will treat you well, please. My wife was also embarrassed and didn't know what to say. At this time, Lu Ruyan spoke. Wang Ji, it's a bit too hasty in the middle of the night. You go home first. I will persuade her in the evening. You can talk about it in 2 days, okay? Finally, Wang Ji left in despair. The three of us breathed a sigh of relief at the same time, and then stared at each other. My wife said with a headache, What should I do? I couldn't think of a solution for a while. It felt that such a ridiculous thing happened to me. I can't send my wife back to Wang Ji's home in person, right? Lu Ruyan frowned and said, Wait for 2 days, I will divorce him in 2 days, I can't live like this anyway. My wife suddenly had an idea and said, We exchanged souls because we drank too much last time, how about drinking some more wine tonight? I rolled my eyes, my wife is really smart, but what surprised me was that Lu Ruyan actually nodded in agreement. Yes, the dragon and the phoenix got together. So at night, we drank a lot of wine again, of course, there was no bloody soul exchange. I rested my head on my arm, listened to the sound of their fighting, and the corners of my mouth curved up. If it was like this for a lifetime, it would be good. 6. Late at night, I was alone in the bedroom, and it seemed that a woman got into my bed. I was shocked to find that it was my wife. My wife was lying in my arms, and when she found that I didn't move, she said dissatisfiedly, Husband, you haven't hugged me for several days. Have you hugged Lu Ruyan these days? I smiled bitterly. Although my wife didn't say it, I felt that she was jealous. My wife bit her lips, thought for a while, and sighed, Husband, do you love my body or my soul? I smiled bitterly and said, I love both, neither of them can be missing. You are you, and no one can replace you. Tomorrow we will go to another hospital to see if we can change it back. Otherwise, not only I will go crazy, but you will go crazy too. My wife smiled, then turned her eyes and pursed her lips. At this moment, I suddenly saw the door opened a crack, and a pair of eyes behind it looked at us in shock. The next day, Lu Ruyan looked at me with a dodge, and my wife and I pretended to be indifferent, and then we went to work. My wife and Lu Ruyan are in the same company. At night, my wife called and said, There will be a dinner party for colleagues tonight. You can bring your family members. Husband, come along. You are the only man in our family now. I had no choice but to attend. I had accompanied my wife to meet her colleagues before, so everyone was familiar with me. After dinner, my colleagues suggested singing and playing games, so I had to accompany them. But as they were playing, a group of drunken men and women started playing the truth or dare game. After Lu Ruan lost the game, a female colleague smiled and said, "Appoint a man to hug for 1 minute." Another female colleague said, "She brought her husband with her." This game is so simple. But my wife, Lu Ruan, and I were dumbfounded. Although Lu Ruan looks like my wife, she is Lu Ruan in her heart. The female colleague was surprised and said, "Su Ro, you are still hesitating? Do you want to hug someone else?" Ha ha ha. Everyone laughed together, and my wife gritted her teeth and said, "Just hug, it's okay, we're just playing games." After getting my wife's affirmation, Lu Ruan and I both breathed a sigh of relief. Then I stood up awkwardly and gently put my hand on Lu Ruan's waist. A female colleague teased, "You're already an old couple, why are you still shy? You want to hug, do you understand?" Lu Ruan gritted her teeth and directly put her arms around my neck, making my body tightly pressed against her. I glanced at my wife and found that her eyes were flickering, and I knew that my wife was jealous. But I had no choice, I was also a victim. A minute later, Lu Ruan pushed me away, but her face was flushed. She glanced at me faintly, and the look in her eyes was indescribable. I thought the game was over here, but unexpectedly, Lu Ruan lost again. A female colleague cheered, "Appoint a man to kiss for 1 minute." What? Before I could react, Lu Ruan hugged my neck again and pressed her lips against mine. Boom! My mind exploded again, and I felt that every cell in my body was beating wildly. I looked aside and saw my wife drinking a bottle of beer next to me. She was obviously very angry. I smiled bitterly in my heart. I had to coax my wife when I got home at night, otherwise she would be really angry. A minute later, Lu Ruan let me go. I saw that her face was red and she looked at my wife anxiously. My wife snorted coldly, obviously feeling a little jealous. In the next game, my wife lost. The female colleague cheered and said, "Lu Ruan, you didn't bring your husband. Let's see how I punish you. I will designate a man to drink the wine on the spot." In fact, the female colleague didn't make excessive demands, but the wife's action in the next second shocked everyone. She directly picked up the wine glass and drank it into her mouth, then rushed over to me, pressed her lips against mine, and sent the wine over. Everyone was dumbfounded. However, at this moment, a scene that shocked me even more happened. The door of the KTV room was pushed open, and Lu Ruan's husband Wang Ji appeared in front of me. He said angrily, "Lu Ruan, is this the reason why you don't go home? Are you worthy of me?" My wife was stunned. She was jealous just now, so she did such a crazy thing. She didn't expect Lu Ruan's husband to appear here. Seeing such a sure scene, several other friends hurriedly persuaded Wang Ji, "It's just a game, don't worry about it, and don't quarrel." Wang Ji shouted with red eyes, "You play games at home and kiss a married woman? This matter can't be over." Several colleagues had to leave immediately, and there were only 4 of us in the room. I said a little embarrassedly, "Brother, don't worry about it, this is all a misunderstanding, I apologize to you." My wife was also a little scared, she hid behind me, which made Wang Ji even more angry. He tried to grab my wife's arm, but Lu Ruan slapped her away. After calming down, Lu Ruan said, "Wang Ji, now that things have come to this, there is nothing to talk about. Lu Ruan told me that you are not in love and she wants a divorce." Wang Ji narrowed his eyes, picked up a bottle of wine and drank it all, then his eyes flickered, staring at my wife, and then sighed and said, "It's a flash marriage, there is no love, you can divorce, but you have to give me 2 million. 2 million? Is it a big mouth?" Lu Ruan said with disgust. "I am rich, but it is all our pre-marriage property. I can't give it to you. You changed the conditions." Wang Ji had a gloomy face and thought for a long time before saying, "Give me a good memory. We met on the top of the mountain camping. I need to relive it, and then I won't divorce you for a penny." My wife shook her head and said, "You look too scary now. I dare not go camping with you alone." Wang Ji pursed his lips and looked at me. "You can go too. The 4 of us will go together. After camping, I will let Lu Ruan get free. You can consider it." I have plenty of time. Wang Ji raised his mobile phone and shook it and said, I recorded the video when you were playing games just now. If you don't want the matter to be made public and you are ruined, either give me 2 million or accompany me to climb the mountain and camp. You can choose. After saying this, Wang Ji slammed the bottle of wine on the table and left. 8. The three of us looked at each other, not knowing what to do. After returning home, we all sobered up. After my wife and I asked her repeatedly, Lu Ruan told the story of her and Wang Ji in bits and pieces. Lu Ruan is a beautiful, rich woman. Her family has been urging her to get married in recent years. She met Wang Ji when she went to a wild camping activity half a year ago. Wang Ji is handsome, gentle, and polite, and Lu Ruan has a good impression of him. So the two got married in a flash, but they were not happy after marriage. Wang Ji not only did not touch her, but also acted mysteriously every day and often asked Lu Ruan for money. This made Lu Ruan very dissatisfied, and the fuse was also the small square. Now Wang Ji actually threatened Lu Ruan, which made her a little panicked. My wife comforted me, why don't we give him 2 million? He still has the video. If it is released, the three of us will be ruined. Husband, why don't we give half to Ruan? I was about to nod, but Lu Ruan frowned and said, I'm afraid he is asking for too much. If he asks for it this time, he will ask for it next time. We can't let him do what he wants. My wife pondered for a moment and said, and we can't call the police because there is no evidence. Even if we call the police, it will be a divorce lawsuit. I smoked a cigarette and said, let's do this first. We still have time. I will pick you up and drop you off at Get Off Work these days. Be careful of his revenge. I will ask someone about his situation. The problem will be solved. Don't be afraid. My wife hugged me and said, husband, you should also pay attention to safety. I am very worried about you. Lu Ruan saw this scene, lowered her head and remained silent. In the next month, Wang Ji didn't come to see us again. I picked up the two women to and from Get Off Work every day, accompanied them shopping, and played with them. I felt a little reluctant to leave. Sometimes, when my father-in-law asked us to go home, Lu Ruan and I would lie in the same bed. Sometimes she would ask me why I didn't give my wife a child. I said in a tangled way. I love her, I understand her, she wants to leave me a child, but this would be unfair to her and you. Lu Ruan sighed and sobbed softly. The three of us seemed happy on the surface, but if we were not careful, we would fall into the abyss. During this period, I was not idle. I asked someone to secretly follow Wang Ji and found that he had a problem. That is, he often went in and out of a bar, which was a bar for men. He would bring different men home every night. I looked at their photos and fell into deep thought. Could it be? 9. A month later, Wang Ji called us and asked us how we were thinking about it. After consulting the two women, I decided to put an end to this matter, so I agreed to his request to camp. Maybe when Lu Ruan gets divorced, we can return to our normal life. But I knew it was impossible. As long as the two women were not exchanged, our emotional bond would not be untied. Instead, it would become tighter and tighter, and finally become the rope that claimed our moral bottom line. The next day, we were ready and drove to the foot of the mountain, where we saw the haggard Wang Ji. He grinned and said, Brother, you are here, thank you. I waved my hand. After my investigation, this Wang Ji did not have the courage to harm us. Maybe he really wanted a perfect memory, but I did not let my guard down. I also hid something in my pocket. We came to the mountainside and set up 2 tents on the platform. My wife and Lu Ruan also liked nature very much, so the two women took photos while enjoying the beautiful scenery. Wang Ji and I set up a barbecue stove and grilled meat and vegetables. Wang Ji opened a can of beer and said, Ruan, I will go with you to get a divorce certificate tomorrow when I go down the mountain. Thank you for your tolerance during this period. I toast you with this glass. Thank you, sorry. My wife was stunned, and then she also picked up the beer and clinked it with him. Wang Ji also recalled the days he spent with Lu Ruan, and seemed a little sad, with tears welling up. I comforted him from time to time, and finally told a few jokes, and the atmosphere became cheerful. In the end, the two women drank too much, and they returned to a tent hand in hand. Wang Ji looked at the campfire, with a flickering light in his eyes, and whispered, Brother, they all love you, I can see, who will you choose in the end? I looked in the direction of the tent and said faintly, Brother, when you love someone, is it her body or her soul? Wang Ji stood up and said, Of course it's the soul. If the other person dies, you can only remember the soul, thoughts, voice, and smile. I frowned, not knowing what he meant. Seeing him come to another tent, I didn't follow him in, but stayed with my wife in Lu Ruyan's tent. After this night, I should be able to get relief. The next day, we went hiking. Wang Ji walked in the front, and the three of us followed silently. After reaching the top of the mountain, Wang Ji opened his arms and shouted loudly, "I've been to this world. Ha ha ha. Ruyan, look, how beautiful it is." My wife frowned and took 2 steps forward. I suddenly felt something was wrong, so I shouted, "No! Come back!" Just then, my wife seemed to slip and fell off the cliff. I flew over and grabbed my wife's hand at the moment she fell off the cliff, but my body fell with her. Lu Ruyan also wanted to grab my feet, but I took her down with me. The three of us slid down a height of more than 10 meters. My clothes were hooked by branches, and I was holding a woman in one hand. There was a 100-meter cliff under my feet. I looked up and saw Wang Ji looking at us with a smile. Then he picked up the phone and said in a panic, "Help, my wife and a few friends fell off the cliff, come and save them." After the call, Wang Ji squatted down, picked up a stone and threw it on my shoulder, then left with a smile. It was his good work. My lips trembled a little, and my hands had no strength at all. Lu Ruyan cried and said, "Let go, let me die, so you still have a chance." My wife cried and shouted, "Please, let go, otherwise you will die too." I still gritted my teeth and insisted, "Don't talk, we all have to live, and none of us can die." Lu Ruyan suddenly asked, "We are going to die, who do you love? Tell me." I looked at her face and said, "I love my wife, not her face, not her soul, but the obsession engraved in my bones. My wife is a code name, my wife for life." "Ruyan, I'm sorry." Lu Ruyan suddenly smiled, and she cried and said, "Husband, thank you for loving me." I was stunned. Why did she call me husband? At this moment, she struggled to break free from my hand and fell straight down. At that moment, I knew clearly. She is not Lu Ruyan, she is my wife's body, my wife's soul. They did not exchange, I was deceived by them. Blanche! I roared, lifted up the real Lu Ruyan, and then jumped down, chasing my wife. 10. I was unconscious for 3 days before I woke up. I had 3 broken ribs. My wife looked at me tenderly with bandages on her hands. We were both entangled by vines, just like our love, which no one could cut off. Lu Ruyan was fine and was being questioned by the police. My wife saw that I looked fine, so she told me the truth. She wanted to leave a child for me, but she knew that I loved her deeply and there was no other way. So she found her best friend Lu Ruyan, who happened to be unhappy in her marriage, so the 2 women hit it off and wanted to perform a trick of exchanging souls. They thought about it for a long time and learned each other's expressions and manners. So this period of time taught me a lesson. But they didn't expect Wang Ji to have such extreme means of revenge. Later, after the police investigation, it turned out that Wang Ji bought a high-value insurance for Lu Ruyan. If she had an accident, Wang Ji would get tens of millions of compensation. And he had set a trap on the top of the mountain that day, just waiting for Lu Ruyan to step on it. The reason why Wang Ji wanted so much money was because his partner was sick and had a terminal illness. Wang Ji himself was also infected. I opened my mouth wide and listened to my wife's narration in amazement. Finally, my wife lay on me and cried, "Why are you so stupid? You are a big fool, why did you jump down?" I stroked her face and said, "You are mine for the rest of your life. I will not let you go even if I become a ghost. Who told you to set me up and almost let me down?" My wife blushed and asked tentatively, "Husband, are you in love with her?" I shook my head and said, "I was in a trance before, but Wang Ji's words that night moved me. Although he was extremely evil, he was also a sober person." "What did he say to you?" My wife asked quickly. I looked into my wife's eyes and said with a smile, "To love someone is to love her soul. If the other person dies, all you can remember is the soul, thoughts, voice, and smile." My wife smiled and nodded, and I pinched her cheeks. In the end, Wang Ji was sentenced for intentional homicide and insurance fraud, and it is estimated that he will not live to see the day he is released from prison. 2 months later, my wife was found to be pregnant. 3 months later, I was discharged from the hospital, and my wife and Lu Ruyan came to pick me up. Lu Ruyan smiled and said, "Brother-in-law, when can we play soul swap? I can sleep with Ruru." I thought about what happened that night, smiled and said, Okay, then I will hold your hand from behind. Lu Ruan blushed. My wife and I laughed. End.